Association for Manufacturing Excellence webinar titled Reshoring, Don't Go Lean Without It. I am Jerry Strohmeyer, the Education and Training Program Coordinator for AME, and I will be your moderator. Today's presenter is Harry Moser, the founder and president of the Reshoring Initiative. Harry has over 45 years of manufacturing experience, including 22 years as president of AgieCharmilles Technologies Corporation, now GF Machining Solutions. Harry's honors include SPE's Mold Designer of the Year, Industry Week's Manufacturing Hall of Fame, and Quality Magazine's Quality Professional of the Year. Harry has a Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering and a Master's of Science in Engineering from MIT, plus an MBA from the University of Chicago. He has written a chapter in the book Remaking America, as well as articles for Target Magazine. He is a frequent speaker at AME events and annual conferences. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. You will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. You will see that you are muted on your attendee panel on the right side of your screen. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into your question area in the attendee panel and click on Submit. We'll review the questions at the end of today's presentation and answer as many as we can. When you log off today, please check your email inbox, and it will be an invitation and link to fill out a short webinar attendee survey. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey today, as your feedback is very important to us to improve future webinars. Harry has also graciously agreed to provide a PDF of today's presentation. We will be sending that along with a recorded link for a webinar replay to each of you next week. Now, I am pleased to introduce Harry Moser, who will present Reshoring, Don't Go Lean Without It. Take it away, Harry.
Thank you, Jerry. That was a very enthusiastic intro. I appreciate it. And I appreciate everybody taking their time to be with us today. I chose the title, Reshoring, Don't Go Lean Without It, because of the continuous improvement focus of AME, and because so many companies go lean and forget to look at total cost of ownership. They forget to look at how reshoring can be a main pillar of their lean effort. And so I thought that would put some emphasis on it. The title I often use is the one you see below that on the page, To Reshore or Offshore, How to Objectively Decide. So the main offering of the Reshoring Initiative is tools for making that decision, for looking at all the costs instead of just the price or just the wage rate, and making a decision that's more consistent with knowing all of the costs, all of the considerations that should apply. So we're going to go down here, and right now we didn't do it. There we go. Huh. I'm wondering. Okay, now it works. I listed here some of the AME members that we know have been doing reshoring, and also FDI, foreign direct investment. So you can see a list of them there. I believe there are many more, but this is just to show you that the AME members, the corporate members, are actively reshoring. This is a chart that I pulled out of Industry Week, a supply chain webinar by Simon Ellis, a well-known expert on the subject, and he listed, based on survey, the top supply chain priorities for a broadly surveyed group of companies that they were going to do in the next 12 months. And I think this brings things into focus. You can see, like most companies or most supply chain people, their number one priority is reducing costs, not exactly defined, but reducing costs. But then there's a whole list of other considerations, more customer-centric, improve service performance, improve supply chain visibility, respond more quickly, bring new products to market more quickly, et cetera. And if you look at that list, every item below the first one is clearly enhanced by reshoring. It's so much easier to do all these things when you're producing the things in your own factory, or you're sourcing them, somewhere locally, let's say in the region of the state. And even in the first item up there, the eliminate waste clearly happens when you reshore. So the only thing that's left is reducing the price element of cost. And you might say that the purpose of the presentation of the webinar today is to show that indeed all those other items are simplified or mitigated by reshoring, the waste is reduced, and that one can do the calculation and see if the advantages of all those things are enough to offset the still remaining typically higher manufacturing costs in the United States. A couple of definitions: reshoring, backshoring, onshoring, insourcing, next shoring, right shoring. They're all talking about making the accurate decision by looking at all the relevant factors, the accurate decision as to where to produce or assemble the product, and especially the product that will be sold or assembled here. So it's not about this U.S. making toasters and shipping them to India. It's about the U.S. making most of the appliances, cars, ladders, what have you, that will be used here in the United States. As I mentioned, transplants or foreign direct investment follow the same logic. The reason Toyota and Mercedes choose to make cars in the U.S. is because they understand that their economics are enhanced by producing in the market. The same reason that GE brings back appliances. It makes more sense to produce near the customer. Caterpillar calls it localization. This graphic helps understand what it is. Reshoring is the green, that's the United States, and then nearshoring would be Canada, but more likely Mexico because of the lower wage rates in Mexico, and offshoring would be the rest of the world. And obviously we favor reshoring. That's what I'm here to emphasize. But sometimes it makes sense to nearshore. There might be a product that's now over in China or India, and a U.S. company says, "Can I bring it back?" And they say, "If I had to bring it all back into the U.S., there's too much labor-intensive components, and I just can't get it back, no matter how much I automate, no matter how lean I get. But if I put some of that labor-intensive portion into Mexico and keep the higher tech portion in the U.S., then can I bring it back?" And then maybe then the answer is yes. So there are times when it makes sense for the U.S. and Mexico, in effect, to compete as a team against some place that's halfway around the world, because it's better for the U.S. to be part of the winning team rather than all of the losing team. We got into the excess or the heavy offshoring largely because of the low wage rates in other countries. Initially, Mexico, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, now China, eventually India, Vietnam, whatever. And the survey says that about 60% of the manufacturers only look at the wage rate, or they only look at the purchase price or the landed cost, and as such they're missing maybe 20% or more of the total cost of offshoring, and therefore sometimes they're making a mistake. And our job, my job, is to help them understand all of those other costs and then make more objective, more holistic decisions that are more in the interest of the company. So in addition to companies having made often used the wrong methodology, but sometimes made the right decision, in addition to that, times have changed. This is a line chart that shows the trend in indexed unit labor costs in manufacturing in a variety of countries. And so whatever the dollar unit labor cost being the dollar value of the labor going into making a typical product, whatever that was in each of the countries, it was indexed to 100. And then each year going forward, the value was adjusted for the change in the wage rate in the local currency and for the exchange rate of that country relative to the dollar, and for the productivity change in the country. So you can see for the U.S., it stayed flat at about 100, and that's because we've had roughly 2% wage increases, 2% productivity increases. They balance out. You stay at 100. Most of these other countries are significantly influenced by currency changes, but the outlier here is China. You can see that China is up to 400. So the cost of labor per product produced is now about 4 times what it was back in 2000, and therefore the cost gap, the ex-works price gap relative to the U.S. has significantly closed due to that change in wages. So Boston Consulting Group has looked at this and projected that into the future. They wrote this, maybe 4 years ago, and said that they thought by about 2015 that unit cost labor would get close enough, that gap would get small enough, that if you take a hard look at the total costs by about 2015, that it would make sense to produce a fairly broad range of products in the U.S., specifically in the Southeast and Texas, rather than importing them from China. So they didn't say that our manufacturing costs would be lower, but that the gap in manufacturing costs would be offset by looking at those other costs that had been so often ignored. And then those costs might include the obvious things like duty, freight, and packaging, but also the carrying cost of inventory, the travel cost, the intellectual property risk, the impact on innovation when you separate engineering from manufacturing, just a whole range of these other factors that companies have historically ignored, but now as that wage gap gets smaller, become much more relevant to the decision. So the Reshoring Initiative, the group that I founded and lead, provides a series of tools and resources to help companies do this. We have a total cost of ownership, TCO software, online on the website, free to use, and the OEM, they say the customer company can use it for sourcing. Should I make that in my factory here or my factory over there? Should I source the castings, the forgings, the machine parts, the wire harness, the whatever here in the U.S., or should I source it offshore even if I'm assembling the end product here? So, and for suppliers, for the smaller companies, those that supply all those components, it can be a sales tool. It can be a means of convincing that OEM, that bigger company, that the company should be sourcing from them by helping the bigger company understand all of those costs instead of looking just at price. We have an online library. It's actually up to 2,100 now reshoring articles. So you could go into that and say, in our region, who's reshoring? Might be a good company to sell to. Or in our industry that we sell into, who's reshoring? Or in the industry that we produce in, who's reshoring? And that might give you some ideas of what you should do, or again, people you might sell to. We have a case studies template for posting cases of reshoring. So if you reshore, and you can reshore either as the maker of the end product or as the supplier of the components that go into the end product, then you can report that on our website and receive a free Manufacturing is Cool t-shirt made in the U.S. out of U.S. cotton. We supply solutions to major supply chain problems. All of us read about the West Coast dock dispute that delayed shipments for a month or more. And if those companies that had been importing the products had been sourcing in the U.S., they would not have been exposed to that risk. Motivation for skilled manufacturing careers. I think most of you are familiar with the shortages of tool makers, precision machinists, welders, all these skills. All the kids are told, all the smart kids are told they have to go to university, and therefore we've had a severe shortage of people going into these skilled careers, and it's not surprising because the smart high school student looks around and says, everybody's offshoring. We're in a post-industrial society. I'll become a doctor, or a lawyer, or a teacher, or whatever it is. Why would I want to go into manufacturing if there isn't going to be any of that here in 10 years? And so the best way to prove to them that there will be careers and that they should get the training that we need them to get is to have them see that reshoring is happening and that it makes sense for them to go into manufacturing. So the TCO Estimator, our core offering, is used by the company, the user. You answer a series of questions. It starts with the X works price from the U.S. and from the other country. It fills in, does a whole bunch of calculations to calculate all the other factors, and comes up with a total cost for each of the countries, and has that for the current year, the current values, and then it does a 5-year forecast based on the user's assumptions of changes in wage rates and changes in currency relative to the dollar. It's got explanations, it's got references, it's got instructions, and it's free to use. So I encourage everybody to take a look at that. And if you're in the supply chain group, then use it. If you're in the selling, you might use it in the selling, or if not, recommend it to the people in your company that could take advantage of it. So here's just a simplified version of the inputs that go into the decision. Some of them are hard numbers or firm numbers, like in this case the Chinese price is 70 and the U.S. price of 100, the quantity, the number of shipments per year, the weight, kind of things that would determine freight and duty and things like that. And then some are softer, like the intellectual property risk, the impact on innovation, the product liability risk, the fact that it's much harder to recover on a product liability issue from a Chinese supplier than it would be from for example, from a U.S. supplier. And I mention China because, as you'll see later, about 60% of the reshoring has been from China. So here's the, you answer all these questions, about 29 or 30 of them, and this is the automatically generated output. So here's that Chinese price, ex-works price at 70, and the U.S. ex-works price at 100. So the procurement individual might look at that and say, wow, that's 30% difference. I'm going to source 12,000 units a year. That's $360,000 of purchase price variance. That's a third of my objective. I'm going to get my bonus. Of course, we'll have it done in China. But if the individual uses total cost and sees that today it's 98 for China and 108 for the U.S., and now it's only 10% when you include all the relevant factors, and then making conservative assumptions about future wage and currency changes, in 2 or 3 years it's going to be higher sourced from China than produced here or sourced here, then a logical assumption would be that the company would no longer send any incremental parts abroad and would start to make decisions to bring work back and to hire and to train and to invest, or to find local suppliers and get them to invest, because strategically, over the next couple of years, it's going to make sense to reshore. So we take the data that users input into the system. We don't ask them company name. We guarantee to protect their confidentiality, but we analyze the data. So I took a group of cases of that were input by the users, and for the offshore, and I think they were all China, we call the total cost 100. You can see the landed cost on average was 87%, and the purchase price was 77%. So there's somewhere around 20% at least gap that is missed when the companies use these more simplistic measures. Another way of looking at this, we took the first 19 cases we had in of China versus the U.S., and in 5% of the cases, so 1, the U.S. had the lower price, but in 53% of the cases, the U.S. had the lower total cost. So in 48% of the cases, tipped from the China column to the U.S. column by making the decision using total cost instead of using price. So I think it's probably a little exaggerated. So I say conservatively that maybe 25% of what has been offshored would return if companies shifted from price to total cost for doing their analysis. So, I'd like to emphasize the next point, especially for the AME audience. Deming said, end the practice of awarding business on the basis of price tag. Instead, minimize total cost. And it sounds to me like something that Moses might have had on the tablet, because it's such an obvious, clear, both business-wise and ethical position. And so he wrote this in his out of the crisis. It was his 4th key principle for management, and other experts since then, Womack, Shook, and so on, have written very similar articles. Companies should do the math kind of thing. And yet many of the big companies that do lean and brag about their lean successes totally ignore this aspect, which is one of the simplest ways to achieve the lean and generally the continuous improvement process. So here's a table that has the 7 Toyota wastes listed over here in the first column, and how offshoring makes each waste worse. So companies that are doing lean and proud of their methodology, I think if they look at this, they make a significant effort to reshore as one of the easiest ways to make their lean process work. I mentioned the West Coast port problem last year. Subaru assembly in the U.S. was spending $59 million a month on air freight expenses to get the parts in they needed to keep their production running. So just huge amount of waste brought about because of the fact that they had extended supply chain lines. There are counter-arguments to this. For example, there is a skilled labor shortage, as I pointed out. There is currency manipulation. Some of the other countries, if they find they're losing competitiveness, they buy U.S. bonds and manage to get their currency back down. We have gaps in our ecosystem. We used to make everything here, and now we've lost some areas and make almost nothing in certain segments of the ecosystem. So there's some challenges associated with that. There's a cost of transition. I work with a company up in Vermont called Hubbardton Forge, and they make high-end lighting systems. And they source die castings from China, and they used our system, analyzed it. It would make more sense to make some of those here. And they brought some of the dies back and sent the dies out to U.S. die casters, and the die casters refused to use them because the tooling was too simple, too crude, too manual, too whatever. And so they sent the dies back to China, and instead of bringing the existing product back to the U.S., when they came out with new designs, they'd make a decision, should it be made in the U.S.? If so, make the tooling here and do the die casting here, and if it should be made in China, send it off and follow the old process. So there is a cost of transition. Here is a slide that shows just a very small sample of the 350 companies that we know that have reshored in the U.S. And as you can see, some real big companies up here, famous kind of companies, and generally smaller companies down here. I emphasize two of these. This Wright Engineered Plastics is a plastic injection molder out in Santa Rosa, California. And if you go to their website, you'll see very much of their focus is on helping companies reshore plastic components. And ACE Clearwater Enterprise over here is a metal fabricator for the aerospace industry that, again, has done a fair amount of reshoring. So I put this up because although the big companies and generally the OEMs get the publicity for reshoring, because often there's a new factory and there's a governor with a golden shovel and all this kind of thing, often there's more jobs brought back at this supplier level than there is at the OEM level, and especially because companies have divested so much of their internal production. So it's very important to recognize that, and for companies that are in the supply chain that are lower in the tier structure, to know that when the big company reshores, makes a decision to source locally, and they get to do it, they've reshored just as much as the big company has. So a couple of examples here to give a feeling for this. GE brought back water heater, refrigerators, and washing machines from a contract manufacturer in China to their own facility in Louisville. A heavily unionized, huge facility, had been something like 20,000 employees, so big that it had traffic lights in the parking lot. It was down to just a couple of thousand. GE had been trying to sell it for years, never could get what they wanted out of it, and they brought back these three types of products and set up the key to success was they set up a war room, and they'd bring in, let's say, the water heater that was being made by the contract manufacturer in China, and they had a team of their marketing people, design engineers, manufacturing engineers, foremen, factory worker, fixture designer, suppliers. Everybody tore these things apart and put them together in a smarter fashion, and they did it so well that when they were done, the thermal efficiency was improved, the warranty costs were reduced, and even though the U.S. Compensation of the factory workers was 5 times or more higher than that of the Chinese workers, when they were done, the U.S.-made product sells at retail in the U.S. for 20% less than the product they had been importing from China. Second, I think, interesting item here, you see down here that when they were done, the ex-works price from China was still below the ex-works price from the U.S., despite all that amazing improvement. But when they looked at the total cost, when they considered inventory and everything else, the U.S. product had the advantage. Here's one of the AME corporate members, and I'm not going to go through this, but just let you see some details. So we have slides like this on about 300 of the cases of reshoring, and we'd love to create a slide on your case if you've reshored and report on what you have done. So again, I'm not going to go through details, just let you see that. The biggest reshorer finally is Walmart. So Walmart has announced that they will, over the next 10 years, buy an incremental $250 billion, that's with a B, dollars of U.S.-made products. And starting at zero and ramping up in the 10th year, which is 2022, to $50 billion per year. And in that 10th year, we calculate that amounts to about 300,000 U.S. manufacturing jobs and about and Boston Consulting Group says that's maybe 1 million total jobs, including the multiplier effect. And so this is huge. This is like 2.5% increase in U.S. manufacturing just by Walmart. Now they have to succeed, and they're working really hard to find companies who are now importing and selling to them, to get those companies to manufacture here in the States instead, or to get other companies to replace the import. So if any of you produce a consumer good or have customers that produce consumer goods and you think you can be competitive and produce it here in the U.S. and sell it to Walmart, you've got a willing buyer here, a motivated buyer. I'd encourage you to take a shot at it. We give some ideas on where to go, what links to go to submit products. And as a little more on this, as an example, Walmart went to this 1888 mills in Griffin, Georgia, and asked the company to produce a gazillion towels for them a year. And the company said, well, we'd love to do that, but we'd have to build a whole new factory and invest tens of millions of dollars, and we're not willing to do that because you could cut us off in 6 months. And Walmart gave them an extended term contract so that the company could confidently borrow the money and make the investments and the improvements and the automation and the capacity and make the whole thing happen. So Walmart isn't flexible on the price, but they are flexible on some of these terms that can make the difference in putting the deal together. Some other companies, MOREY Corp in Illinois, I've worked with them, and they had an issue with they make circuit boards. They were bringing in a housing for the circuit boards. And they had some kind of problem, must have leaked, must have done something like that, and it was a big problem with their customers, and the customers insisted that MOREY change the sourcing to locally, to U.S. And they found an Illinois source. They fixed the quality problem, but equally interesting and important, they cut the inventory of the component by 94%. They cut it by a factor of 18. And now that's extreme. That's why I put it up there to get your attention. But in case after case that we read about, the inventory is reduced by 50% or 2/3 or something like that, because you don't have the long supply chain. You're not paying early or much earlier than you typically would pay a U.S. supplier. You don't have the extra inventory because you don't know when the container is going to arrive and what the quality of the product is going to be in the container. Speaking of which, here's another case, Bailey Hydropower, which makes hydraulic cylinders, and they were making them in India, some of them, and importing them. And they switched that back to Tennessee, and one reason was, it used to be they'd be maybe a little late on deliveries to their customers, but the new container arrives off the container ship, and they open it up, and the quality's bad. They can't ship them to the customers. And so now their deliveries are worse, but they say, but there's another container coming in a week after this one. There's another one a week behind that on another boat, another one a week behind that. And then you say, wow, I wonder if those are good or bad. Because if they're good, we're going to be okay. But if they're bad and we wait for them, we're out of business. We've burned our bridges with all of our customers. So do you fly to India and make sure that the process is fixed and start air freighting good cylinders back to the U.S. so you can ship on time, but at a freight cost that wipes out your profits for the quarter? or do you sit there and wait for the product to come in out of the other containers? And there's no way to solve the problem because you can't get into the containers and find out what the quality is. Whereas if you're producing them in your own factory, you're producing them 30 miles away, you go there, you fix the problem, maybe you lost 2 days of production, but you've taken away the uncertainty caused by that pipeline that cannot be inspected. There's been a lot of surveys on the subject. Boston Consulting Group has found when they survey manufacturing executives that the percentage either interested in or actively reshoring has risen dramatically from 2012 to 2014. And they say that China's cost advantage is down to 5%. I think that's probably 5% for products shipped into the U.S. as opposed to 5% at the FOB level. Alex Partners had similar kinds of results. MFG.com surveyed contract manufacturers, found many of them had done reshoring. In another survey, other surveys that we've consolidated, there's a significant increase in consumer preferences for made-in-USA products. So it's not only is it relatively more cost competitive to produce things here, increasingly the U.S. consumer is preferring that made-in-USA product, especially relative to a made-in-China product. And so if any of you are in the consumer product business and wanted to contact me and ask for a copy of the analysis of those consumer preferences, we'd be happy to send it to you. As an overview of this, sort of the 60,000-foot view, this chart shows what's happened. Back in, say, 2003, we were offshoring an incremental about 150,000 manufacturing jobs a year, and reshoring and foreign direct investment, maybe it was 12,000, some number like that. Hard to tell way back there in the past, but so total losing about 140,000 manufacturing jobs just to the offshoring process net, excluding productivity improvements and recession and things like that. Whereas in 2014, the offshoring, the new offshoring was down to maybe 40,000, and the reshoring and FDI was up to maybe 60,000. So we've got a net gain of 10 to 20,000 a year. So it's a huge reversal from losing 140 to gaining maybe 10 or 20, although there's still 3 to 4 million manufacturing jobs offshored. And so although we've stopped the bleeding, we still need to get the patient totally healthy. So I mentioned our library that has about 2,100 articles in it about reshoring. And we slice all the data out of those articles on a company-by-company basis, and then we analyze it. So you can see here the industries, basically NAICS code industries, and how many jobs, how many companies in each have been reported to have reshored. So it gives you a feeling for where the action is. And now this table shows the negative reasons, the things that went wrong offshore, and most of them are proximity driven. So, for example, freight cost, lead time, total cost, delivery, inventory, communications, loss of control, supply chain interruption. Those are all manifestations of lack of proximity, and then some are country specific, like quality or rising wages or currency variation, for example. Okay. Now here's the positive reasons to reshore, the things that they came back to the U.S. for. And number one, the image brand, the fact that they're now offering a made-in-USA product. Automation technology, redesign of the part. Walmart specifically came in 35 times as the reason. Lean, as I talked about before. So you can see what's motivating companies to do this. About 60% or maybe two-thirds of the cases of reshoring are from China. And then the logical other companies or countries that you would expect. Very little from Europe. It's very much of an Asia developing country phenomenon rather than a Europe or Canada kind of condition. This chart shows the distribution of the reshoring jobs and companies by state. So you can see the tendency is very strongly over here in the southeast and Texas. with then a few of the heavy industrial states where the companies brought back to work more or less into their existing facility. But the tendency is for the greenfield facilities, the new developments, to go out into those those southern lower cost, non-union, right to work, it's a lower tax rate states. I sorted through those reasons that I showed you before, and to pull out those that related best to the AME mission. So specifically, as I mentioned, 27 of the companies explicitly mentioned lean, and then I took the Toyota production system wastes and looked and saw how many really were from that, and about 422 were. So about 58% of the reasons given were Toyota production system related factors. Impact on innovation, U.S. skilled workforce, but I think that tells the story that there's a tight connection between reshoring and the ability to implement lean and continuous improvement and do it effectively. This naturally has economic impact for the country, so the Commerce Department has been actively involved. They've been promoting total cost. We've worked with them. And then the MEP, the local groups that help companies with manufacturing issues. Back in January of 2012, one morning I had 2 calls from Washington. One was from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, the other the White House National Economic Council, and both of them asked, what do we have to do to bring manufacturing jobs back from China? And I said to myself, wow, if I'm going to get 2 calls from Washington in one day, better these 2 than the FBI and the IRS. And those calls then resulted in going to the White House the next week for the Insourcing Forum. That's President Obama's term for reshoring. And this is obviously the president, and this is Harry. And when I send this out to people that don't know me, I tell them I'm the bold guy there talking to the president. And at that point, I was giving him some tips for the State of the Union message, and he had me send them to his aide, but my tips did not make the cut for the State of the Union. And then this was on C-SPAN that afternoon, the bold guy again making a couple of points. So I mentioned skilled workforce. I think it's very important because often when I present, if I don't bring it up, somebody raises their hand and says, Harry, we don't have enough people now to produce what we're making now. How are we going to make 20% more, 30% more? Where are we going to get the people? So back in, I think it was late 2012, the Labor Department called me down to Washington to advise them on how to get the workforce ready for reshoring. And we were in the Secretary of Labor's conference room. And I stand up and say, well, first we have to recognize that the Labor Department has to go from being part of the problem to become part of the solution. And they fortunately didn't throw me out, and they said, okay, wise guy, what's your point? And I pulled up this page from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it shows income going up with number of degrees. Income going up with number of degrees. And the implication is that the only way to get ahead is to get degrees. And I told them this is the kind of data that convinces the educators, the guidance counselors, the superintendents, the parents, the students, that everybody's got to get a degree. It doesn't matter what kind of degree you get, just get a degree, as opposed to some other alternative. And I said this should say education and training pay, and you should have the income of people that have passed an apprenticeship in here or that have 5 or more NIMs or other manufacturing certificates. And they instantly said, yeah, you're right, we should do that. And they've changed the page. They've gone about halfway to the text that I'd like, and they're doing a survey to get the data on the apprentices so as to put a more balanced approach into the page here. So I was delighted that they were so agreeable and flexible on the subject. So we came up with a skilled workforce program that if you're having problems with skilled workforce that you might consider in your community, and that is to do what the Swiss and the Germans do, refer to these people, the tool makers, precision machinists, the welders, the plumbers, etc., as professionals, the tool-making profession, and get rid of the terms trades and vocations, because no mother wants her kid, almost no mother wants her kid to go to trade school, whereas they'd be happy to have a tool-making professional in the family. The other is to get the local community, get all the companies in the community, Cleveland, whatever it is, Ohio, whatever the case is, to report their cases of reshoring on our website, fill in the form, you create a case study about it, and then get the local media, the local TV, radio, newspaper, whatever, to report the local reshoring cases of the month so that the guidance counselor, the student, the teacher can say, wow, reshoring, manufacturing is coming back. This is great. Yes, Susie, it makes sense to become a welder. You don't have to go to university and study philosophy or whatever else that Susie was thinking of doing. We also have an economic development program that's underway in Pennsylvania and Mississippi, and is also starting up in central New York. And it involves the state economic developers and these MEPs identifying everything that's being imported, and then going to the companies that are doing the importing and saying, why don't you produce more here inside your own factory, or source more at all the wonderful suppliers we have in the state? And the company says, wow, you think we're stupid? The wages are too high here, the taxes are too high, the prices are too high, so we buy it somewhere else and outside the country. And then we train them on total cost of ownership, and they say, well, maybe some of that we should bring back, either in-house or outsourced. And if there's still some additional cost reduction needed, then you bring in this MEP or the community college, this technology suppliers, to help get the cost down, to close that small residual gap, where when there's a 30%, 40% price gap, it wasn't even worth making the effort. So at your company or at your customer companies, if you want to get started, I wouldn't pick parts at random and start doing total cost. I would ask about pain and opportunities. So if I'm at a company, I say, tell me about some parts where your delivery is hurting you, where you're losing orders due to delivery and slow response, where you're having quality issues, or your inventory seems excess, where you've got a lot of travel and you're worried about IP loss. Any of these kinds of factors, let's pick a couple of those. And so now you've got some champions in the company that are motivated because they want to eliminate those issues. They want to put that behind them and find a reasonable solution, but a cost-effective, reasonable solution. And the total cost system lets them see whether or not the total cost is indeed reasonable for bringing it back. So you can help the reshoring process by using the tools for sourcing and selling. We have archived webinars. You're going to get this one from AME. You can use that for your staff and with your customers. You could post a link on your own website to our site to talk up the case of reshoring and the benefit of domestic sourcing. You could have me out to speak for one of your events, or let's say you're selling into an industry that has done a lot of offshoring. You might want to get me into that customer industry conference to talk up reshoring, talk total cost of ownership. So when you come in there to sell, when your company comes in to sell, they've been softened up. As I mentioned before, submit your cases of reshoring. How we can help you, we have all the data I described. We can train. We have that consumer preference data. We can help with the analysis. We'd be delighted to have AME members decide to use the tool and call me for some help or email me for some help. Just delighted to help you. AME has been very helpful to us. We'd love to promote your success in reshoring. Here are some useful tools. There's this ACE tool. ACE means assess costs everywhere. That's on the Commerce Department website. So here's a link to that. Then the cost differential frontier I'm going to get to in the next slide or two. The TCO Estimator, that's our tool that I described. There's a how-to guide, how to get started with that, the library, all the other programs I talked about. I give you the links here, so all you have to do is click through to those on our website. You don't have to go scurrying around trying to find things. So I mentioned the cost differential frontier, and this was developed by Professor Detreville, Suzanne Detreville. She's American, but she teaches at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And the tool is designed to help companies quantify the advantages of shorter lead times by finding for a given part, and based on its volatility in orders and its disposal value or obsolescence value, but by considering those factors, see how much more you can afford to pay to get the shorter lead time that eliminates or mitigates those costs. So here's a typical case. Demand has a peak that's 3 times the median demand, 1 out of 10 periods, let's say months. And the selling price is 100. The local production cost is 44, but offshore it's 30% cheaper. And when you liquidate the value after the demand period, it's only worth $20 instead of the $100 that you'd like to sell it for. So think of Christmas tree ornaments or very seasonal clothing, for example. This would be a relatively extreme. And so here's that case. One would fill in the blanks here and on some of the other like calculator down there that you push a blank and you go to. In this case, it said for that case, there's a 39%. You can afford to pay 39% for a very short delivery relative, 39% more for a very short delivery relative to what you're now paying offshore. That's a huge, 39% is huge, and this represents only 2 of the cost factors that are included in the total cost of ownership estimator. So in addition to this 39%, there might be another 15 or 20% duty, freight, packaging, all those other kinds of things. So the Reshoring Initiative is a not-for-profit. We've got 38 sponsors, organizations that either just want us to succeed because they know it's good for the country, or that want the credibility of being associated, or that use the connection with this to have me come out and speak and write articles and so on. So AMT puts on IMTS, the big machine tool show, 114,000 people at McCormick Place last year, a great success. Bank of America has been very supportive. SME, Society of Manufacturing Engineers, Gardner, puts on Modern Machine Shop and a bunch of other really great magazines. The company I used to run, George Fisher, Machining Solutions, Machine Tool Distributors, National Mining Association, a whole bunch of machine tool companies and manufacturing trade associations, more of the same. Just we've been blessed to have all these people support us and make it possible to do what we do. So one of our earliest sponsors I'm very appreciative of is AME. They jumped on board with us probably 3-4 years ago and have been very supportive of us. We have various projects we work on together on skilled workforce, on reshoring, and we're delighted to be part of that partnership. So finally, this is how we think of ourselves. This is the picture represents the little Dutch boy. So the story is that this is Holland, and this is the North Sea, and especially when there's a storm, that you need the dike to keep the North Sea out of Holland because the land is so low. Otherwise, you get floods and you get nothing to eat, and people drown, and all those horrible things. And so a little Dutch boy is walking along in the dark, and he sees a hole in the dike, and it's still a little hole, but there's water coming out, and there's a couple little stones are coming out, and the big stones are just starting to shake a little bit. And he says to himself, wow, this is going to go. So I got 2 choices. I can run and get the village elders and get them to repair the dike, but I'm afraid by the time I get back, the dike's going to be gone, and it's flood, and no food. It's horrible. Or I stick my finger in the dike, hold it all together, and hope the village elders find me there in the dark. And so conceptually, this is the United States, and this is offshoring, and this is Harry when Harry had hair, and you're the village elders. And if you say, Harry, that was an interesting entertainment now at lunchtime, or whatever, good to hear, hope you're enjoying it, good luck, guy, well, then probably offshoring gets worse. But if you take the message and apply it in your company and encourage your friends that offshore to reevaluate, if you use it as a sales tool to convince your customers, then we'll have more reshoring and less offshoring. We'll have better jobs in the U.S., and the U.S. will be a better place for you and your children and your neighbors. Although I mentioned U.S., There's reshoring efforts underway in Canada and in most of the European countries, in Japan, in Korea, Australia. So reshoring is not strictly a U.S. phenomenon. It's a recognition of the economic value of producing in the market for the market, and it applies pretty much universally around the world. So if any of you are from outside the U.S., I hope you'll see this as also a tool that you can use. So with that, I'm done, and I'm open to questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. And now, as Harry said, that we'll review any questions. So if you do have any questions, please submit them on the right side of your screen, and I'll read them. And actually, we have one here. How much of this logic applies to U.S. company goods that are sold in other countries?
Okay, so we're talking about exporting, and certainly if a product had been exported from here and now was made offshore, and then if it was made here again and still be exported, I'd call that still reshoring. But the focus isn't on that. The focus is on producing in the U.S. what we consume, and logically and consistently on other countries producing in their country what they consume. And if all countries did that and were more self-sufficient, and not crazy, but we're not going to make plant rubber trees here, and we're not going to grow some things that you can only get in bananas, stuff like that. So they're not being crazy about it, but being more objective about it, that the U.S. is the one that benefits the most from this, because our offshoring, our trade deficit, which is the best measure of offshoring, in manufactured goods is about $500 to $600 billion per year. That's with a B, and that is about 25 to 30% of our current manufacturing output. So if we balance the trade deficit on manufactured goods, U.S. manufacturing will rise by 25 to 30%, and it's certainly the largest value by far of any country, and probably about the largest percentage. So a general trend towards localization, encouraged by total cost of ownership analysis, et cetera, will benefit the U.S. the most of all of the countries. So nevertheless, going back to the question, is if a company says they're going to go into the Chinese or the Indian market and start making things over there for those countries, like GM and others have done, I think that's just wonderful. I don't consider that to be offshoring. That's just good business, going over, producing the things in that country for that market, and hopefully remembering to produce in the U.S. the things for the U.S. market.
Okay, great. We have another one here. Since there have been many efforts to revitalize manufacturing, why is the reshoring initiative different?
There's conferences every day about the renaissance of manufacturing and advanced manufacturing and increasing manufacturing and all these things. And too many of the groups that do those things, although they do very good analysis, they tend to just write about it and talk about it. And I separate us a bit from them in that we go out and do something about it. We're actually working in the states to educate the companies. We're actually providing the tools for doing the analysis. We collect the data on the trend, because the best way to motivate a company to do the analysis, to do the reevaluation, is to see that other companies are doing it and that their competitors are doing it, and if they see that happening, they'll at least reevaluate. So just like they offshored largely because they saw their competitors offshoring, we don't tell them to reshore because the competitor is reshoring. We suggest it's in their interest to at least reevaluate and see if it makes sense to reshore. And so I think that's pretty clear.
Okay, great. Thanks. So here's one. Thank you, Harry, for this movement. You're a great American. I see so many companies make poor decisions on make versus buy because they do not know how to do the analysis correctly. So that was a great comment. So
That's great. I appreciate that. But I'm only a great American if I can convince all of you or many of you to convince others to start doing the analysis properly. Otherwise it's just talk. So really love to hear from some of you. If you know some companies where you think the company's made the wrong decision, maybe a place you work or place you used to work, you've got my email address up here. Email me and say, Harry, let's go together. Let's take that company on and get them educated and convince them to bring it back. And I'll bring a pile of the T-shirts for everybody. Everybody will know that manufacturing is cool.
Great, great. Thanks. Here's another question. What are examples of products that may be no-brainers for reshoring? For example, large and lightweight.
Yeah, there's a couple of there's a lot of interesting concepts on this. Most people would say high volume goes to, say, China, and low volume, customized, tends to stay here. And certainly that's been generally true, but if I think you can split it a little bit more and say that, yeah, the low volume, very customizable, quick delivery logically has to stay here. But I think the highest volume increasingly should be amenable to automation. Robots are getting so good and so inexpensive and so easy to build into the line, like Baxter from Rethink Robotics, that you should be able to get the labor content down enough that you can't in any way justify that offshoring and all of the logistical penalties, all these extra costs associated with it. So I think instead of saying we get the short end and sort of China gets mid to high, maybe it's we get the more customizable, shorter quantity. We get the high end, a lot of jobs, a lot of investment there, and then maybe we fight over the middle. Something like that, I think is a good analysis of it. And then obviously there are considerations about freight costs. So if it's big, has lots of material, and not a huge amount of labor content, then it makes a lot of sense to do it here because the freight costs are going to wipe you out. If there's a lot of design changes, if the design changes every month and the samples of the new prototypes have to be surface rated back and forth, it's going to take you a year to go through a couple of iterations. Whereas if you're making those prototypes right close by and going to produce right close by, now obviously you can get through that in a couple of weeks or a month. So there's a intellectual property, high intellectual property, make it here. Subject to automation, needs a lot of skill, a lot of factors like that. If anybody wants and you email me, I used to do presentations on how to decide what to make here versus what to offshore, specifically, just in a general sense without the quantification of the total cost. So anybody that would like that, if you email me, I'll send you a copy of that presentation.
Okay, great. Great. And I think we have time for one more question. How do we convince our customers to source and or assemble here?
Okay. I'd say the best is to probe for first tell them about the cases. If your customer is making widgets and you go on our website in the library and you find cases of widgets, then print out the articles about those cases of widgets being reshored by a competitor of your customer and say, look, your competitor has decided to do that and they say that they're much more profitable. It's working for them. Let's see if we can make it work for you. That'd be, to me, the most obvious place to start. Once you've got their attention, you're probably not going to reshore all of their widgets in the same decision. So then I'd start asking them about the cases where they're having the pain, the opportunities, the delivery, the quality, the intellectual property, the too much travel, the too much inventory, and then get them involved in doing that analysis. Now, it may be the supply chain person, the procurer, who gets a bonus based on purchase price variance, won't cooperate. And then I'd say you go around them and you get the lean champion, the compliance manager, the quality manager, the division manager who's suffering from the excess inventory, the travel costs, the late deliveries, all these other problems, while the procurement or supply chain person's getting a bonus for having minimized purchase price. So you either go through the front door, and if you can't get through the front door, then I guess climb in the windows and attack from behind.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you, Harry, for a very insightful presentation. This brings our webinar to a close. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, May 14th, titled How to Sustain Your 5S Improvements with David Visco. In addition, we are hosting a special free webinar on Friday, May 1st with the Association of Equipment Manufacturers titled Reaching Compliance. This webinar will provide an increased awareness on the current regulatory issues of EU REACH, the European Union regulation on the registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals, EU RoHS, the European Union restriction of hazardous substances and conflict minerals. Please visit AME.org under AME Events and Training tab for more information and to register. And don't forget to fill out the short survey that will be in your inbox. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a productive day.